What's up YouTube? Today we're going to be going over my Venom Gyre build that I played in the BPL. It was quite a blast. As you can see here, this is me doing Uber Shaper on a character roughly with less than I think 2 days playtime total or less. And the fight is quite hard as you can see, and we're going to go over the strengths and weaknesses of the build and what I actually thought about it. Now, disclaimer, I did find an Omniscience. So I had pretty good gear overall. I also got kind of lucky on the weapon recombinators and made a pretty good claw, but I do think that you can replicate most of this in SSF right now. Or maybe not SSF, but in Trade League if you wanted to start it out and try out a Deadeye. But you can see here, Uber Shaper down was a pretty difficult fight, but definitely doable on this build. So let's go straight into it and see how good Venom Gyre is in terms of a league start scenario. So, like I said, I decided to play it in the BPL to try out how good it is at League Starting. And as you can see here, this is my second Exarch kill. This is not the Quest Exarch. And I ended up getting an Onyx Amulet, which is an Omni. And I couldn't really believe what happened. And it's pretty insane, right? And overall, the character had insane map clear that ends up being better than Spectral Helix as soon as you finish off Cruel and Merciless Lab. And the map clear makes Spectral Helix feels really bad. I do feel that if I played Spectral Helix versus Venom Gyre, I would level faster to 95 with Venom Gyre no matter what, because the map clear is just so fast that any differences in boss speed would pretty much be negligible. Now the build did end up finishing Uber Eater of Worlds, Uber Shaper, Uber Elder, Uber Maven, and Uber Cortex, and all of my gear was pretty much SSF. I did have them craft me 2% attribute rings, but other than that, I think I crafted almost every single piece of gear myself. But I did get lucky, as you can see here, in farming Syrian Exarch and finding the Omniscience Amulet. Now, in terms of the bossing capability, Venom Gyre is definitely not the best bosser, especially if your damage is not insane. Now, the reasoning behind this is because Venom Gyre can shotgun with Whirling Blades, but you have to know to fight very well, and you also have to be really good at the game in terms of being able to dodge everything. So we can just see some example fights I have right here. And this is me doing Uber Eater of Worlds. And Eater of Worlds is quite difficult, as you can see here. There's a lot of stuff to dodge, and you have to make sure that you don't really get hit by the tentacles when you're using Whirling Blades. Because you can see right there, because I'm spamming Whirling Blades, I just get one-shotted right away. And that's just a mere setback. And this phase is also really hard without any recovery. So you kind of want to work around your way in the arena, make sure not to get hit by the tentacle. And I almost died there without the life flask. And again, watch out for the tentacle. So you can see a lot of dodging and a very low uptime on being able to Whirling Blades. And even when you're Whirling Blades, you have to be aware of the Uber Eater of Worlds tentacles coming out and pretty much just slapping you. So you can see here, without insane damage, the damage uptime is pretty low on boss fights. And that's just the case of a lot of builds, especially if you're melee. And these fights really illustrate the difference between melee and range builds like RF, or Righteous Fire is not really range, but Seismic Trap, DD, and other builds like that with very low gear level and what they can actually accomplish. So that's the Uber Eater of Worlds fight. And Uber Maven is kind of the same way. The damage you can see is definitely there if you're able to use Whirling Blades on top of the boss. And this is not too bad of damage because it can shotgun, and a huge portion of the damage does come down to the Tornado proccing. And Tornado not being able to proc is kind of bad. So you can see there, it finally procs and you can see the boss get chunked. So my solution is probably just to put Cast on Crit on Whirling Blades to trigger the Tornado. And I do think that the boss damage will be a lot better. So you can see here, no tornadoes even proccing. And the reason we want Tornado to proc is so that the projectiles can hit the tornado and 4 can create more projectiles to catch. And this is extremely important because the more projectiles we have, the better the boss will get shotgunned. Now, some Uber bosses will definitely be a lot better. Uber Maven, I was able to do Deathless pretty easily, mainly because Uber Maven is a fight that doesn't really have a lot of unfair mechanics. Like Shaper, you saw, had the bullet hell phase, which is pretty actually difficult to dodge, especially without spell block or using a Sapphire Flash. You tend to get one-shotted pretty easily by 2 balls, especially if you get hit by 1, because I think they have penetration on them. But you can see here, the Uber Maven fight is not too bad at all with Venom Gyre, and in this phase with the ads is actually beneficial, because for Venom Gyre, having ads actually helps out your boss DPS. But you can see here, every single time the tornado comes out, the boss gets chunked. But the boss ended up dying at the very end. And overall, I was pleasantly surprised about how easily it could handle some of these Uber fights when you don't really have the best of gear. And as usual, Venom Gyre is amazing in Simulacrum due to the number of mobs and how well it clears. And this is very, very good because I know a lot of people like doing Simulacrums early on. And this does allow you to go straight into Simulacrums and be able to get Wave 30 done pretty easily. Now, for Ascendancy Choice, you might be wondering, do you have to be Deadeye? I would probably prefer Champion if I could get Divergent Venom Gyre and Phantom Blade clusters. And the reason behind that is Champion is a pretty similar tree and it's a lot tankier. And you can use Perseverance Belt to get a lot of damage if you don't use Headhunter or Inspire Learning or Mage Blood. So the reasoning behind that is if you had a lot of armor and evasion, your character would be really, really tanky. And you would also have around the same damage because Perseverance is just that overpowered. Now, if you want to play Venom Gyre straight up right at League Start, it's pretty much mandatory. You have to play Deadeye because Ascendancy does give you +2 projectiles, +1 chain right here. So you can't really play Champion. If you wanted to do Champion Venom Gyre, you would probably have to play Helix until you were able to afford Divergent Venom Gyre and Phantom Blade clusters. And you might be wondering if you could play Berserker, because I always love playing Berserker. I do think that Berserker is probably too stretched on points to really make it work. You do have to travel all the way over here. Then you have to get Call to Arms in order to have high Berserk uptime. And then you have to go all the way over here. Now, another option could be Ascendant. Ascendant does have the same exact pathing as Ranger, but the League Start scenario, Ascendant is a lot worse, especially when you don't have the... Although Ascendant I do think is the best of both worlds, because you do get the Berserker Rage generation, and it does feel pretty good. So maybe Ascendant could be another option that could be pretty good. And Ascendant is also, I think, best for deck stacking late game. So maybe we can try an Ascendant run if nothing changes with the balancing by GGG. Now, gearing-wise, I was capable of doing the league starting, and I decided to do a traditional Omni setup, and I only did the Omni setup because I found an Omni. Let's see how much damage I lose without the Omni. I'm pretty sure you lose more than half your damage. So you can see it's 2.17 mil, and that's purely because I have 1643 Omniscience. Of course, if you had an Amulet, you'd probably have like 3 mil, so you would have around probably half your DPS, so probably 3 mil DPS with a real damage Amulet. So you do lose half your damage, but I do think that it's doable. All the bosses on Champion because you're just so much tankier, but it's just so much more annoying. But you're not playing Venom Gyre to destroy the boss. You're playing Venom Gyre because the mapping clear is so good, and so is Simulacrum. Now, I did end up crafting a pretty insane claw. So let's go over the gear I have real fast. This is a triple T1 claw that I crafted. I pretty much just use weapon recombiners of a T1 cold, T1 fire. And then I did T1 fire, T1 lightning until I had a T1 cold, T1 fire base. And a T1 fire, T1 lightning base. And I recombined those two together and I hit this. And then I did some reforged key prefixes until I got attack speed. And I decided to craft on crit, strength, and int. So it's a really, really strong claw. Now, I'm using Black Sun Crest. The reason I'm using Black Sun Crest is because it gives you a lot of Omni. And it's a pretty easy option early on. If I had to choose again, I would probably choose, what's it called? A Blight Helmet, maybe? Or not Blight Helmet, Blizzard Crown with Sniper's Mark enchant. So you do have a lot of damage I'm missing because this is partly SSF, so I didn't have the Sniper's Mark curse effect. You could also use Venom Gyre damage, or Venom Gyre keeps 25% of projectiles. I did decide to use an Omni, and I used Divine Judgment as an Annoy. It does end up being the highest damage Annoy. You can also technically use Tenacity if you want it to be a little bit tankier. Now for rings, I'm using 2% attribute rings. So this one is 7% strength, 7% dex. And these are some pretty bad rings that I crafted with just using some essences. This is like T1 essence with T4 attribute. And this is another T1 essence with T2 and T4. So these are terrible, terrible rings. And I pretty much just use them because I had no other choice. If you notice, I do craft on the Elrion mana cost to get the mana cost down to 3, which feels a lot better. And for the chest piece, I'm using just a 6-link. I would prefer that this was on an armor evasion base, but beggars can't be choosers. I did get +1 max res with the Syrian Exarch roll, which is pretty huge. And I got Determination Aura effect, and it's just a 31% suppressed chest with high life, high evasion. I decided to craft out percent attributes in order to benefit the Omni a little bit more. I should have probably exalted this with Leo Slam, but I didn't get to have enough time. Now for the gloves, the most important implicit is definitely the Rage implicit. With the Rage implicit, you'll have 50 Rage up the entire fight, so it should be a big chunk of damage. And this is actually one of my better pieces. It's the T1, T2 attributes. Accuracy, which is actually sorely needed, as you can see, 84% accuracy, but with precision, we have 100%. So an accuracy roll is pretty much needed on either your rings or your gloves. And for the belt, we're using a Stygian, and this is just a life, elemental damage of attacks, and Chaos Res Stygian. And boots, I did decide to use Brittle Ground because my crit is not really capped without the Diamond Flask, so you don't want to rely on the Diamond Flask. So every time you Whirling Blades on top of the enemy, you should always be proccing the Brittle Ground. And shield and boots are where I get the ailment immunity from. I get 24% here, 23% on the craft. So that's 47%, and here's 23%, 17%, which is, what, 40%? That's 87%, and then we have 20% on the tree from these nodes. So we're actually ailment immune, which actually helps out a lot. For Pantheons, I'm still using this for stun immunity, and I use this for bossing to get my life flash charges back. Because the biggest problem with this build, honestly, for bossing is that your life recovery is terrible unless you have life flash or you're able to attack. And on a lot of phases for the Uber bosses, you actually can't attack and you're just standing in degen puddles or something like that. And it feels really, really bad. So ailment immunity is really nice, and I do think it's not too hard to achieve. You can also technically get ailment immunity on a synthesized ring implicit. And lastly, I am using 2 large clusters, which I'll get into with the Phantom Blade notables. So for the skill tree, we're using a large thread of hope. I did SSF it off Cyrus, and we use this large thread of hope because it gives you additional chance of fork right here, which is huge. 50% chance for additional projectile while forking, so that's why the tornado does so much damage. You pick up this node here, which is pretty good. It gets some resist, crit chance, and elemental damage of attacks. This node is huge too. It's 50% elemental damage pretty much and 10% pen, which is really efficient. Now over here, we can see we have a Lethal Pride. And this Lethal Pride, I found it actually gives me Intimidate, and that's just terrible. Percent Strength, so that's why I took these 2 nodes over here to get the percent Strength. Melee Crit Multi, which doesn't really benefit us. And I think we have another percent Strength here from the Frenzy Charge. So overall, a pretty nice Lethal Pride that we have going on there. And in terms of the clusters I'm using a Phantom Blades cluster over here with Calamitous. I'm not really sure how good Calamitous is. If I had a choice, I'd probably use Phantom Blades, Feed the Fury. And in this one here, I would do Feed the Fury, Fuel to Fight, Martial Prowess. But beggars can't really be choosers in SSF. If you're trying to roll the cluster, make sure the eye level is around 51, unless you want a Phantom Blade clusters. But overall, this is your standard Ranger right side of the tree, a projectile build tree. And it's pretty point efficient, and that's why I do think that the tree is very suitable for a League Start scenario. And I am using Charisma to run Determination, Wrath, and Precision for the aura. So 1 aura cluster, and then 1 spell suppression cluster over there. Now, overall, I do think the build is very strong. I do think its strengths are definitely mapping and easy bosses. And once you get enough damage, bossing should be a joke. Now, I'll probably League Start this next league and build it into KBMF Deadeye because this is pretty much one of the better Ranger builds, I think, for League Starting. I do think that most people made a mistake playing Spectral Helix early on. I do think Venom Gyre feels better than Spectral Helix Deadeye through almost all stages of the game except the beginning of the game until Merciless Lab, and then until late game when you really need the single target when you're trying to do bosses while you're very undergeared, and Simulacrum when you're very undergeared. And that's when you can swap over to Spectral Helix, but there's really no point in playing Spectral Helix until those stages because Spectral Helix is just so much worse than Clear that it doesn't really matter how good your single target is because you're just going to be progressing the Atlas so much slower. And lastly, this build does have an incredible transition into deck stacking. Venom Gyre and Spectral Throw, but it depends on the boots with the Sentinel mod is going to be removed or not, because I do think without these boots that have the add 2 to 4 cold damage to attacks per 10 decks, I do think that the archetype becomes a lot less valuable and appealing because you literally lose half of your base damage. But thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know down in the comments below if this intrigues you as a potential league start guide for next league. And yeah, I hope you find more Mirrors, Exalted, Mage Bless than me, and see you next time. Bye!